thousands of UK buyers have put down deposits on off-plan properties that have never been built. Not because they made obviously bad decisions, not because the developments were visibly risky, but because the developer who took their money ran out of cash partway through construction and either went into administration or simply walked away from a scheme that stopped making financial sense. In 2025 alone, several significant UK house builders entered insolvency proceedings, leaving buyers in legal and financial limbo that can last years and in some cases has no clean resolution at all. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens when a developer goes bust after you've exchanged on an off-plan property, what your actual legal rights are in that situation, what protects your deposit and what doesn't, and how to properly assess the risk before you commit to any off-plan purchase. I've been tracking the UK property market for years, and off-plan developer insolvency is one of those risks that buyers consistently underestimate because the development looks real, the marketing is professional, and the sales team is confident. The financial position of the company building the homes is a different question entirely. Let's get into it. Before getting into what happens when things go wrong, it's worth being clear about what off-plan actually means and why the risk profile is fundamentally different from buying an existing property. When you buy off-plan, you exchange contracts and pay a deposit, typically between 10 and 30% of the purchase price, before the property exists. You're buying a future asset based on architectural drawings, a show home, and contractual promises about specification, completion date, and price. Between the day you exchange and the day you complete, which can be 2, 3, or even 5 years later, you have a contractual right to a property that doesn't yet exist, with a developer who may or may not be financially strong enough to deliver it. In that window, you're an unsecured creditor of the developer for the amount of your deposit, unless specific protections are in place, and those protections are less comprehensive than most buyers assume.
The insolvency sequence matters because it determines what your rights actually are and in what order they're exercised. When a developer enters administration, an insolvency practitioner takes control of the company's assets and liabilities. Their primary legal duty is to the company's secured creditors, typically the development finance lender who provided the construction loan, not to the buyers who paid deposits. The development finance lender's charge sits ahead of everything else in the creditor hierarchy, which means that if the land and part-built development are sold to realize assets for the lender, the off-plan buyer's deposits may not be recoverable from those proceeds at all. Buyers who exchanged on an off-plan property and paid their deposit into a developer's general account rather than into a designated protected account are, in insolvency, simply unsecured creditors, with the same legal standing as any other unsecured creditor of the developer, which in most insolvency situations means they recover little or nothing. In practice, the recovery rate for unsecured creditors in property developer insolvencies has historically been extremely poor, often pennies in the pound or zero, because the secured lender's charge typically absorbs the entirety of the development's realizable asset value before anything reaches the unsecured creditor queue. This is the core financial reality of the off-plan risk that the sales presentation never includes. Deposit protection is therefore the single most important pre-exchange check for any off-plan purchase, and it is the area most consistently glossed over in the sales process. There are legitimate mechanisms through which off-plan deposits can be protected. Some developers place buyer deposits in a designated client account separate from their general trading account. Some offer deposit protection insurance products, and some new build purchases are covered by a consumer protection code or scheme that includes deposit protection requirements. The problem is that these protections are not universally mandated across all off-plan sales. They vary significantly in their scope and coverage, and the buyer solicitor is the only party in the transaction who will systematically check and explain exactly what protection is in place for the specific deposit being paid on the specific development, which is why having a solicitor who specifically asks these questions matters far more than most buyers realize at the point of exchange. A solicitor who doesn't specifically ask about deposit protection, who assumes the developer's standard contract reflects adequate protection, or who doesn't obtain written confirmation of where the deposit is held and under what terms, is not serving the buyer's interests in this area, regardless of how competent they are in other aspects of the conveyancing. The deposit protection question is specific. It requires specific answers, and those answers need to be obtained and understood before contracts are exchanged, rather than assumed to be satisfactory.
The completion date problem is the second major risk area for off-plan buyers, entirely separate from deposit protection. Even where the deposit is protected, a developer who is struggling financially may push back the completion date repeatedly, sometimes by months, sometimes by years, sometimes indefinitely. Off-plan contracts typically specify a long stop date, a final date by which completion must occur, beyond which the buyer has the right to rescind the contract and recover their deposit. But between the original expected completion date and the long stop date, the buyer is in a holding pattern with limited options. Their mortgage offer, which typically has a validity period of 6 months, may expire and need to be renewed, potentially at a worse rate than the original offer. Their personal circumstances may have changed, the property market may have moved significantly, and throughout this period, they're committed to a property at the original agreed price, with no mechanism to reflect market changes in either direction. There is also a practical life consequence to prolonged delay that's easy to overlook in the financial analysis. A buyer who exchanged on an off-plan property planning to use it as their primary residence has frequently given notice on a rental property, made arrangements around schools, work commute, or family proximity, and organized their life around a completion date the developer is no longer able to meet. The financial cost of delay is real. The personal disruption is equally real, and it's a cost that doesn't appear anywhere in the developer's contract or their compensation provisions. The specification change problem affects buyers who do complete, sometimes long after the original expected timeline. Off-plan contracts contain provisions that allow developers to make reasonable variations to the specification of a finished property relative to what was shown in the brochure or the show home. What constitutes a reasonable variation is a matter of contractual interpretation, and buyers who complete on a property that looks meaningfully different from what they purchased have significantly less recourse than they typically expect. The carpeted floor that became vinyl, the kitchen island that disappeared, the balcony that was redesigned. In each case, if the change falls within the contract's variation provisions, the buyer's remedies are limited, even if the finished product is genuinely not what they understood they were buying. The legal standard for what constitutes a reasonable variation is interpreted more broadly in favor of developers than most buyers expect, and the show home that created the buyer's expectations is specifically not a binding contractual specification unless the contract explicitly incorporates it as such, which most off-plan contracts do not. Buyers who relied on the show home, the brochure, or the sales team's verbal representations about the finished product rather than the formal written specification appended to the contract have very limited grounds for complaint, if the finished property differs from those representations.
The mortgage valuation problem at completion is the fourth risk area. When a buyer exchanges on an off-plan property and agrees a price, the mortgage offer they need at completion is based on the lender's valuation of the property at that point. If the completed property value is lower than the agreed purchase price, the lender will only advance a mortgage based on the lower valuation, leaving the buyer to make up the shortfall in cash or to lose the deal, and in some cases, to lose their deposit if the contract terms don't allow rescission on valuation grounds. None of those options is comfortable, and none of them was presented as a possibility during the original sales process. Now here's what connects all four of these risk areas, and it's the part most off-plan buyers are not told clearly at the point of sale. The off-plan purchase process is specifically structured to generate commitment and exchange before the buyer has full information, because the developer's business model depends on exchanging contracts early in order to use those contracts as evidence of demand to secure development finance from their lender. The sales process, the show homes, the professional marketing, the urgency framing around availability and phase releases are all designed to move buyers through to exchange as quickly as possible. At the point of exchange, the information available to the buyer is deliberately forward-looking, based on projections, renderings, and promises rather than completed reality, and the specific risk disclosures that would give buyers a complete picture of the developer's financial strength, the development finance structure, and the insolvency priority queue are not part of the standard sales presentation.
Here's what nobly puts together properly. The buyers most likely to purchase off-plan are disproportionately first-time buyers, buyers using Help to Buy or similar schemes, and buyers priced out of the existing property market who see off-plan new build as the only accessible route to homeownership in their chosen area. These are exactly the buyers with the least experience of property transactions, the least access to specialist legal advice, and the most emotional investment in making a specific purchase work. The risk of developer insolvency is therefore concentrated in exactly the buyer population least equipped to identify it in advance and least financially resilient to absorb it if it occurs. It's worth naming explicitly what the information asymmetry looks like in practice.
A developer's sales team knows the company's financial position. They know whether the development finance is fully secured or contingent on hitting sales targets. They know whether construction is on track or whether cash flow problems are already emerging. The buyer knows none of these things and has no legal right to demand them as part of the sales process. The information gap is structural and deliberate, not incidental. Here's how this plays out for buyers who don't do proper due diligence. They exchange on an off-plan property, pay a deposit that goes into the developer's general account without protected status, and receive a long stop date that is 2 years away. 18 months later, the developer enters administration. The insolvency practitioner sells the part-built site to a new developer at a discounted price that covers the secured lender's exposure but leaves nothing for unsecured creditors. The buyer's deposit is gone, their contractual right to the property is gone, and their legal costs in trying to recover either will exceed whatever they might eventually receive in an unsecured creditor distribution. The part-built site is eventually completed by the new developer and sold at current market prices to new buyers who have no connection to the original purchase.
Here's how this plays out for buyers who do their due diligence properly. Before exchanging, they instruct a solicitor specifically experienced in new build and off-plan transactions who examines the deposit protection provisions, the long stop date, the specification variation clauses, and the financial standing of the developer. They check the developer's most recent filed account at Companies House and look for warning signs including reduced cash reserves, increased borrowing, or auditor qualifications on the accounts. They ask directly about the development finance structure and whether the development has secured its full construction funding or is being built in phases dependent on sales revenue. They understand the long stop date and what their rights are if the development is delayed beyond it, and they make sure their mortgage offer is renewable within the likely completion window at manageable cost. Here's how this plays out at the market level over the next couple of years. The pipeline of mid-sized UK developers carrying significant balance sheet stress following construction cost inflation and weaker new build sales conditions is not small, and the wave of insolvencies seen in 2024 and 2025 is unlikely to be the last. Buyers currently holding off-plan contracts on developments where construction appears to have stalled or slowed significantly should seek urgent legal advice about their specific contractual position, their deposit protection status, and whether the long stop date affords them any near-term right to rescind and recover their deposit rather than waiting in a holding pattern that may resolve badly in any case. The developers most at risk in the current environment are those with high exposure to the new build apartment market in the specific postcodes covered in earlier videos on this channel, high development debt relative to their sales pipeline, and evidence in their filed accounts of deteriorating cash or increasing creditor pressure. The off-plan purchase can be a genuinely useful route to homeownership, and many thousands of buyers have completed successfully on well-run developments with competent, well-capitalized developers who delivered exactly what they promised on or close to the original timeline. The issue is not that off-plan is always wrong, it's that the specific risks described in this video are systematically underemphasized in the sales process, and the buyers who understand them clearly before they exchange are in a fundamentally different and better position than the buyers who discover them afterward. The deposit you're being asked to pay is a significant sum. The contract you're being asked to sign is a legally binding commitment to complete a transaction that may take years to conclude and whose outcome depends substantially on the financial health of a company whose accounts you can access but whose internal financial position you cannot. Treating those facts as part of the decision rather than treating the show home and the sales brochure as the decision is the difference between an off-plan purchase made with eyes open and one made in the conditions the developer's sales process was specifically designed to create.